So in the UK, what are the human rights policies like?
So well, basically, the protection of human rights is a key issue in delivering of care to people who suffer from long-term mental health disorders. So we're talking about mental health disorders, like in particular. So we have to go by, because we're still part of the EU. I have to include the EU human rights. So that includes Amnesty International, United Nations Human Rights System, European human rights system. They've all played key parts in deinstitutionalization across Europe. So what the policies are here is basically that, and these are the fundamentals of Freedoms Act that I'm going to be reading to you. So it basically means that a large number of people with mental health disorders continue to be ostracised and isolated from society and experience discrimination in relation to employment. Now, the part I wanted to read to you was, this is how the policy is, sorry. So services should respect the autonomy of a person with mental disorders and should empower and encourage such persons to make decisions affecting their lives and should use the least restricted types of treatment.
Isn't it interesting how psychiatry is very restrictive? They're very much concerned, and the more you don't do it their way, typically the more they press you, and they can even force medicate people before they even get violent, really, just based on their behavior and their non-compliance and their moodiness. So, it goes back to, what we were saying earlier, who makes the calls? These are the types of calls that I would argue that no one's qualified to make, you know? So how do you truly say who's qualified to make that kind of a call to where someone can step in and decide your treatment for you, you know, covertly or otherwise?
Yeah, no. But I think the way psychiatry's been generalised as a whole, I mean, we were talking before you were interviewing, was about the psychosocial. So it's a new way of approaching psychiatry, introducing kind of modern kind of terminologies to express psychiatry as something that can be seen as community-based, casual. You can integrate in your life quite well. I don't know how that can be normalised, how something as serious as that can be normalised. And this is pretty much what they're trying to sort of push into the community, is introducing, pharmaceuticals, pushing drugs onto people, instead of providing adequate support for that person, because economically it's cheaper in the sense if they just drug them. But at the same time, the pharmaceutical companies are making like trillions out of it. So it's a very, I mean, I don't know how, I don't think that much study has been done in this area when we're looking at institutes and looking at community-based intervention programs.
Yeah.
So I don't know how it works in the States, but here in Europe, since they were really big on institutes in the 60s, and then come 70s and 80s, they've tried to sort of encourage psychiatry. So it's just really, really been forced into, like normality come after, I'd say after the 60s onwards. So because in the past you would associate, psychiatry with being institutionalized. Now what they're trying to do is make it more sort of socially acceptable kind of thing. So that to me in itself is kind of disturbing, to be honest.
Yeah, it's interesting. Um, what kind of staff do you think are at these institutions? What kind of people are?
Well, the staff, I mean, so basically, like, um, the provisions for long-term mental health care for people with severe mental disorders has always been a major challenge, and the system was due to be reformed. It's constantly being reformed all the time, but there's always issues with it. There's always flaws to it, and it's never going to be something that they can stabilize. So going back to your question, what kind of staffing do they have at these institutes? Well, quite frankly, because they're not willing to fund these institutes, most of them are privately run, so they're private organisations. They go for the cheapest kind of training for their staff, and therefore their staff aren't fully qualified. And this isn't because this is deliberate. It's all got to do with funding. It's all got to do with the budgets and what they consider to be a priority.
Yeah,
And therefore there seems to be, policy levels also have like lack of inadequacy. Mental health policy and legislations, budgets are insufficient. For example, where um, there's always discrimination against a person with mental disorders in terms of there's limited access for them, to be, let's say, like, for example, insurance. When a person has, I mean, let's say, for example, life insurance. A person who has a mental disorder, he's not able to get life insurance. They tend to, things we take for granted. People with mental health disorders, they tend to have challenges finding work, for example. Public sectors and voluntary sectors are supposed to be there as a guarantor, and it doesn't seem to be the case, because let's say the person is made redundant and they're in a job and they're made redundant, there's a likelihood that they could relapse into that state again. So it doesn't really, so deinstitutionalization doesn't really work. This is something they're really pressing on, and really pressing with the pharmaceuticals industry. Like, all you need is the drugs, but you can live a normal life, which is a load of nonsense, to be honest.
yeah. Is there anything else to say on the topic?
Well, no, I just think there's a lack of coordination between the services, and these are all government services. And I feel that the best way to deal with it, what the government's done, is the best way to deal with it is to leave it up to private organisations to have their staff trained. It's a cheaper way for them to sort of shirk the responsibility.
Yeah,
And it's really interesting that, for example, like Amnesty International, United Nations, and all the human rights organisations that really had pushed deinstitutionalisation and introduced pharmaceuticals. That was their doing, and that was to do with human rights. And what's interesting is that that's actually, I mean, your last video where you talk about how many people die, on psychiatric medication.
yeah.
Yeah, can you remember that statistic?
No.
It was something like, how many people die a year? Was it about 1 million across the Western world?
From like 500,000 annually.
Yeah,
In Western
yeah.
countries.
So that's an example of how inefficient this system is. And you have to understand that these are the government bodies who actually who are there to supposedly meant to support people, for human rights. It's actually almost going against what is considered to be human rights. These are life-threatening medications. They kill people, young people, killing themselves because they're not being given sufficient support. And it doesn't mean that, the answer is just by giving them pills is going to be a cure. It just exacerbates the situation even more.
All right. So, I'll leave that topic alone for now and jump into something real quick and wrap up this video in a couple minutes. All right, unless you had anything else to say about it.
No, I was just thinking of your situation, Chuka, that you've been forced into an institute unnecessarily. I mean, you're a really calm person. You're very helpful. I just don't understand why, you've been subjected to this time and time again, it just doesn't make any sense. So there's no other reason why this would happen to you unless you are definitely a targeted individual, and there seems to be an agenda to, poison your life constantly.
Yeah, definitely. And it goes back to, the universal, this is from state.gov, Appendix A, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? You look at Article 3, everyone has the right of life, liberty, and the security of person. 4, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. 5, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And that's pretty much what going to the psych ward unnecessarily is. Let's not forget about the, UN protocols and the Nuremberg Code and other things that I've gone over in the past about human rights violation. In fact, Dr. Colin Ross's book, The CIA Doctors, is the human rights violation of psychiatrists, I believe it's called. The human rights violations by American psychiatrists, Colin A. Ross, MD. And then there's a long history of compulsory sterilizations and unethical experimentation in the United States. So when you look at this thing, you look at the different experiments America's performed, and they're famous and they're taught all over. And the Zimbardo experiment and the Milgram experiment, some of the most famous psychology experiments, sociology experiments, social experiments, that there are. And it's about pain. Go ahead.
When you're in when you're put into an institute now, it's not exactly the same as it used to be, because what they're trying to ascertain is how best to control you with what medication, with what psychiatric medication. So it's trial and error for them. It's literally trial and error for them. It's not a case that this person, there's no benefits for that person, because the chances of that person going back into a psych ward is likely to happen. So relapse is constantly the case. So that in itself proves that psychiatry is just a fraud. It doesn't work. These institutes they're not adequate enough to support people from severe mental health disabilities. And I just think it's an area that needs more investment, and I just think that's something the government doesn't want to do. When it comes to people's well-being, governments shirk away from providing, society with humane treatment.
Cool. But we're out of time.